What I'm hoping to do is really in 4 parts. So the first part is I want to invite all of us into an embodied experience of gender. And so I'm going to do that. And for those of you who are comfortable, you might consider standing up. You might consider closing your eyes. You don't need to stand up if you're happy and comfortable sitting. And then I'll give some framing remarks about gender and then tell a little of the story of how I got into this work and what kind of revelations have happened for me as a result of it. And then complete with some sort of closing systems overview ideas. It's going to be a lot of ideas, but let's start with our bodies because I think they're a really essential part of our humanness and of the feminine. So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes if you're comfortable doing this. And this exercise is actually borrowed from a beloved sister friend, a woman named Claire Dubois, who runs an organization called Tree Sisters. And it's just a way of feeling in your body the twinning of gender in how our masculine and feminine combines to make our human wholeness. So I'm going to invite you to breathe rather deeply and slowly. And as you breathe, imagine that as you breathe in, that's your feminine side receiving what life has to offer, receiving guidance, receiving intuition, receiving nurturance from the mother, receiving all that brings life. And as you breathe out, imagine, please, that that's your masculine side. That's the parts of us that are in action, the parts of us that know what needs to be done, and the parts of us that can be very single-focused and vector-like in acting in the world. And of course, we all contain masculine and feminine. And keep breathing as you listen to me, and just keep imagining into your feminine side being filled up by your in-breath, and your masculine side expressing into the world with your out-breath. And so, of course, we all contain both. And, of course, we have a cultural inheritance that's a little twisted, a little corrupted, or toxic reflections of what the actual sacred feminine and masculine are. So as you breathe in, I want you to recall times in early childhood. Recall how your mother and your school and your siblings and your classmates and being in nature might have fed you in your in-breath. Recall your actions, your play, your energy, your enthusiasm, the expression of who you were as a child. And then trace yourself getting a little older and notice how in school there came to be more and more emphasis on your output, on your homework, on all the things you needed to do to achieve, on sports perhaps. If you played an instrument, what was required for the discipline to get good at that? And keep breathing in and out. Notice the balance of your in-breath and your out-breath. And then trace yourself going through high school and college and notice how the emphasis might have become stronger on how you performed, on what you did, on how well you achieved. And as you notice that, adjust your breathing so that your out-breath becomes longer than your in-breath to match your own experience. And in college, notice the emphasis and the demands, and your social life was swirling, and all the things that you were trying to juggle in the outer world, and all of the ways that it was necessary for you to push and strive and effort and do in order to accomplish your goals. And notice how that quiet inner taking in and listening for guidance might have become lessened, and adjust your breathing accordingly. And then you might have come out into the world and realized, oh my gosh, I guess this is adulthood. I need to find a way to earn a living. And notice the pressures and the activity and the competition and the effort that was required to do that. And notice how it might have affected your in-breath, your receptivity. And then you're in the work world, and many of you are parents. And notice what it's taken to juggle those two huge bodies of work of being a parent and being in your path and in your work. And notice again the effort, the work, the drive, the productivity that our culture has demanded of us, and adjust your breath accordingly. So very gently, I'm going to invite everyone back. Open your eyes. And just to offer, for me, when I do that, I find myself going, oh, right. There's this wonky imbalance in my body. And I think about this a lot because I believe that we've all got an inheritance of that imbalance. And so, part of the work of this time, of course, involves reclaiming healthy definitions of the masculine and the feminine so that we can reclaim some kind of equilibrium in our lives as human beings and not what's often referred to as human doings. Carl Jung, the great archetypal analyst and psychologist, suggested that the feminine is actually associated with our interiority and the masculine with our exteriority. And then if you look at how our societies are organized, there is so much emphasis on the external and so little on the internal, which is why it's such a joy and honor to address this work within the context of the Festival of Faiths, where really the wellspring, as we all know, comes from the internal. And as someone said earlier, what if the role of the feminine in us all is to provide the guidance so that the masculine in us all knows how to act? I find that in relation to that Carl Jung quote of the interior and the exterior, one of the things that I've found in my own 20-year inquiry about gender is that our society tends to have us operating largely from our minds, and tends to undervalue and undersee and underhear the wisdom that comes from our bodies and from our hearts and from our spirits or our dream time or our intuition. And so I believe part of this work of revaluing the feminine so that our human offering to this magnificent Gaia can be two-handed and in balance is to really emphasize and listen especially for the wisdom of our bodies and hearts and spirits. So here's what my experience has been. I came to this recognition of gender rather late in my life. I was in my mid to late 30s, and I had gone through a very difficult period where in rapid succession, a company that I had been nursing into existence or midwifing into existence was taken over. And my father died very suddenly. And I found myself feeling really lost and broken and kind of a puddle. And a friend offered to loan me a film. And she loaned me a videotape. This tells you when it was, early 90s. And she loaned me a videotape. And it was a videotape that's a film that's available online. And I commend it to you. It's called The Burning Times. And if you just Google it, it will show up and you can watch it for free online. And The Burning Times is somewhat dated at this point, but it tells the story of the 200 to 300 year period in European history, where throughout most of the nations of Europe, 7 generations of children saw their mothers and grandmothers and aunties and sisters pretty systematically persecuted and tortured and often burned for the supposed crime of being witches. And when I saw this film, I was just aghast. It was an epiphany for me. It was the first time that I really had this identification of myself as a woman, because I had really assumed coming out of college that I was stepping onto a fairly even playing field. And it wasn't until I was in the business world and experienced sitting in a boardroom surrounded by men and offering a suggestion and feeling like no one heard me. And then the guy sitting next to me would basically say the same thing. Any of you experienced this? And people would go, "Oh, what a great idea." And I was like, well, this is interesting. And so when I saw The Burning Times, what happened for me was, first of all, I wondered why I had never heard about this growing up in grade school or high school or college, and why, the Salem witch trials was like teeny tiny compared to what happened all over Europe. But also, I thought it was the first time that fear that had lived inside me made any sense. I had grown up with this fear that if I spoke my truth in public, something really bad was going to happen. And I had no idea where that had come from. And when I saw the film, I went, oh, that story lives in my bones. I just know that it does. And somehow I believe that just like fish don't see the water we swim in, it lives in all of our bones. I believe it's a cultural inheritance. And I started researching the film after I saw it because I really had to know, is this true? Is it this large? The numbers are hard for anyone to agree on. There's not good documentation, but somewhere between tens of thousands and as high as millions of women were systematically tortured and killed. And I thought, well, if this is true, I need to understand more. And as I researched, what I found was that all these systems in society had changed as a result of the Burning Times. That at the beginning of the Burning Times, women owned more wealth in Europe than men did. And by the end of the Burning Times, that wealth had been redistributed. And at the beginning of the Burning Times, there were actually more women in Europe than there were men. Nobody's quite sure why, maybe the Black Plague, but by the end, that was evened out. The demographics had shifted. But also there were other societal systems, like at the beginning of the Burning Times, women were the ones who practiced medicine. Women were the herbalists and the midwives and the hospice workers. And by the end of the Burning Times, you had to go to medical school, and only men were allowed to go to medical school. The midwives and the herbalists were among the first, right, to be persecuted. There was a shift in land relationship and the relationship to land. At the beginning, it was much more common that land was held as a common right and shared by the community. And by the end of the Burning Times, the enclosure system had happened in Europe, and people were imagining land as private property. And then the last thing, of course, maybe the deepest, was that spirituality and religion shifted from a direct relationship with the divine, which often had a relationship to the earth and was manifest and celebrated in ways that might be considered pagan, to an intermediated relationship where the young man asked earlier, why do we need organized religions? Well, the Burning Times made sure we had organized religions and that male gods replaced the female gods. So I was kind of stunned, and it just completely shook my worldview and set me on a path to understand how, what I saw was that for the first time in my life, all of the various problems that I had come to understand from Bioneers about global warming and inequity and the loss of species and toxicity, all these things could be seen through one lens as a manifestation of the imbalance between the masculine and the feminine in our world. So just a couple of quick observations before I close, that this reemergence of the feminine that's happening all over the US in all these different forms is also happening globally. It's happening politically. It's happening in every sphere of life. The UN has basically proven that the more you improve the equity of women, the more all of life's systems improve. The more economic systems improve, and health systems improve, and peace and justice improve. So it's not just a doctrine. It's actually been proven. I always love it when science proves what we all already intuit to be true. And the last thing I want to say is that, actually two more things. In honor of this place as a home of Wendell Berry, I want to point to a notion of his that I love, which is solving for pattern. And it's an essay, and if you haven't read it, I commend it to you. And what he says is there are three kinds of solutions to any problem. There are some solutions that make the problem worse. There are some solutions that address the initial problem, but they create other problems. But really what you want to seek out is the solution that when you deploy it, it improves everything. It has cascading benefits to all the living systems around it. And so I think that's true about restoring the feminine and gender equity and healing the relations between the masculine and the feminine for us all. It's one lens that actually solves for pattern. So with that, thank you. Thank you, thank you.
So we'll take just a couple minutes to invite either one of you to reflect back on something Nina might have said or ask for further clarification, and we'll move on.
Well, I just thank you for taking on that bit of this conversation around gender, because I also, as you know, have found that it is foundational to gender, confronting gender is our topic in every sector, and I'm talking about the witch hunts, the so-called witch hunts in Europe, and even the way that has played out within indigenous community has become clear to me. So thank you for naming that, for placing that here at the forefront of this, and I just. I'm sure we'll have more time to talk about it, but I just wanted to notice that about the women holding the wealth. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I believe this is a difficult subject, because it is also touching on power, right? And that's a very important issue in our modern world. But the women holding wealth, I think about it from Dene perspective, and the ologists, as I like to call them, say that it's a matrilineal society, but I think you can't quite sum it up that way. But the wealth passes down through the women's side of the family, through the women, and it's held that way. And so they say that a Dene divorce is the woman puts the man's saddle outside the door. And that's his signal that he can take his horse and his saddle and go. And initially I thought, wow, that's pretty harsh. That's pretty intense. But really there's a whole system of why that can be, and that has to do with the mother. So this man has an opportunity to go to his sisters, to his mother, to the wealth holders of his people, essentially. And so I thought a lot about this, and I just keep thinking that, I think the assumption there was that the guiding principle for the mother side is that all the children are fed. And so the wealth was entrusted on that side. And so I just wanted to point out that that's a very ancient culture principle. And so I call that also moving from pyramid economy to circular economy.
Thank you for that, Woman Stands Shining. I also am aware, as I hear you, that I often look to the Haudenosaunee who are also known as the Iroquois, as a model for the masculine and the feminine living in balance. And in that model, which actually informed the US Constitution, and which at that time the founding fathers were meeting with the Haudenosaunee, who were saying to them, you have two problems. One of them is, where's the women? And also this slave thing. It's gonna get you, And I was like, wow, if only they'd listened then. But in their model, the women actually are responsible for controlling the resources for the tribe, while the men are facing outward in a more protective role. And it makes sense, as you say, because making sure everyone is fed for the long haul. You know?